December 6, 1941, Washington, D.C. The night is quiet inside the U.S. Navy's Communication Annex. Fluorescent lights hum softly above rows of typewriters and teletype machines. The smell of paper, ink, and cigarette smoke hangs in the air. A handful of cryptanalysts, men and women whose names history barely remembers, are still at their desks. They aren't soldiers in uniform. They fight in silence, through language and logic. On one desk sits a sheet of paper marked "From Tokyo to Washington." The cable had been intercepted hours earlier. It's written in an elegant jumble of numbers, Japan's most secret diplomatic cipher, known only as Purple. An operator feeds the string of numbers into a strange electromechanical machine, a collection of wires, plugs, and relays that hums like a ghost. The sound is gentle, but the tension is not. The message begins to unfold, word by word, through the electric rhythm of the codebreakers machine. Relations between Japan and the United States can no longer be continued. The translator looks up, his face pale. Another message follows, then another, 14 parts in total. Each decoded line feels heavier than the last. By dawn, the final segment comes through. It's a diplomatic death sentence, Japan's notice of intent to sever relations with the United States. To the men in that room, the implication is clear. Something is about to happen. But the hour is late. The messages are sent up the chain of command. There are delays, confusion, protocol. By the time the decrypted warnings reach the highest desks, it's December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m. in Hawaii. The first bombs are already falling on Pearl Harbor. Cut 2. Black smoke rising over Battleship Row. The crack of anti-aircraft fire, radio operators screaming for confirmation. And somewhere back in Washington, a clerk folds a decrypted cable and sets it on the desk, unaware that it contains the echo of a disaster already unfolding. This is the silent world behind the war, where information itself was a weapon, where battles were fought not with bullets, but with symbols, and where a group of mathematicians and linguists, working in secrecy, achieved one of the greatest intelligence victories in history. Its code name was Magic. Before radar hummed over the Pacific or fleets clashed at sea, a quieter war was already underway. One waged in codebooks, intercepted signals, and sleepless nights. The interwar years were supposed to be peaceful. But beneath the polite exchanges of diplomats, nations were arming themselves with something far more elusive than steel or oil: information. By the late 1920s, Japan's military had begun encrypting every diplomatic message using elaborate ciphers, first with simple codebooks, later with machines inspired by Germany's early Enigma designs. Their goal was absolute secrecy. For a nation planning expansion across Asia, control of communication meant control of destiny. But across the ocean, inside nondescript government offices in Washington and at a small naval compound in Hawaii, a handful of Americans were listening. They were mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers, most with no military background. Their task: intercept and decipher messages the Japanese believed to be unbreakable. The U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service, SIS, and the Navy's OP-20G Division were small, underfunded, and often ignored by the very generals they served. Yet they were building the foundation of a new battlefield, one defined not by territory, but by knowledge. It was an era when encryption was still seen as a gentleman's art, not a weapon. But in the shadows, both sides were experimenting with mechanical devices that could scramble messages faster than any human mind could follow. Every click, every tone on a radio frequency carried secrets. Troop movements, diplomatic orders, even personal appeals from ambassadors who didn't know their words were being silently stolen from the air. Historians later called it the Invisible War. No medals, no front lines, just minds locked in silent combat. One trying to hide the truth, the other trying to reveal it. And in the early 1930s, amid this quiet arms race, a new Japanese machine appeared. Its design was a mystery, its code seemingly unbreakable. The Americans would name it Purple. Washington, D.C., 1939. In a cramped office inside the old munitions building, a man with tired eyes studies a wall covered in paper strips, fragments of intercepted Japanese messages. The man is William Friedman, the U.S. Army's chief cryptanalyst and perhaps the most brilliant codebreaker America has ever produced. He doesn't wear a uniform. He wears a tweed jacket, wire-rimmed glasses, and the look of someone who spends his life inside patterns. To Friedman, letters and numbers are not symbols. They are voices waiting to be understood. Friedman's team, a few dozen mathematicians, engineers, and linguists, work under what they call the Signal Intelligence Service, SIS. The Navy has its own unit, OP-20G, and together their mission is to do something no one has done before: build machines to read another nation's mind. The challenge begins with Japan's most secure cipher, one created using an electromechanical encryption device, soon codenamed Purple. It replaced earlier Japanese codes like red and blue, both of which the Americans had already broken. But Purple was different. It wasn't just a code book, it was a machine. A complex array of stepping switches that scrambled each letter according to constantly changing circuits. And the Americans didn't have a single clue what it looked like. Every intercepted message was a tangle of letters, radioed from Tokyo to embassies around the world. The SIS had to reverse engineer the encryption purely through logic, probability, and obsession. Friedman's office became a kind of monastery for mathematics. Days blurred into nights, sheets of paper lined the floors. Some analysts went home, dreaming in ciphers. One of Friedman's assistants recalled that he would stare at the patterns for hours, whispering, "It must be deterministic. It must follow a rhythm." But as the complexity deepened, the toll mounted. Friedman suffered nervous exhaustion and collapsed from the strain. He was hospitalized for months, leaving his small team to carry on his vision. Under the guidance of cryptanalyst Frank Rowlett and with engineers like Leo Rosen, the SIS began constructing their own machine. Not a copy of Purple, but a functional twin built from deduction alone. Using telephone stepping switches from old AT&T systems, they recreated the Japanese logic piece by piece. One night in September 1940, the device came to life. The clatter of relays filled the room as an encoded Japanese message began to resolve into clear text. For the first time, they could read what Tokyo thought was unreadable. They named the project Magic, because what they had achieved felt impossible. From that moment on, every Japanese diplomatic message could be intercepted, decrypted, and studied, sometimes within hours of its transmission. The U.S. had, quite literally, built a window into Japan's soul. But as the team would soon learn, reading the enemy's secrets is only half the battle. Getting the right people to act on them, that was another war entirely. To understand the scale of what the Americans achieved, you have to understand what they were up against. The Japanese Purple machine wasn't just a cipher, it was a mechanical labyrinth designed to erase logic itself. Built by engineers of Japan's Naval Technical Bureau in the mid-1930s, Purple was the successor to an earlier encryption system known to American cryptanalysts as Red. Red had used simple alphabetic substitutions and manual key changes. Clever, but still predictable. The Americans cracked it with pattern analysis. Purple, however, was something else entirely. Instead of humans turning code wheels or consulting tables, it relied on electromechanical stepping switches, the same kind found in the early telephone exchanges. Each letter typed on the machine would pass through a cascade of circuits, changing its route every time. What came out the other end was chaos. A letter scrambled according to a wiring pattern that shifted with every keystroke. The Japanese believed it was unbreakable. Even they could barely trace the permutations. The machine itself, encased in polished metal, its dials marked in kana script, was distributed only to Japan's most trusted embassies: Berlin, Rome, London, and Washington. Each day, operators changed the internal wiring based on secret key tables transmitted via couriers. Every day, the system reinvented itself. And yet halfway across the world, American analysts were quietly listening. Army and Navy radio intercept stations, scattered across Hawaii, Guam, and California, captured the encrypted messages as they bounced through the atmosphere. They couldn't read them yet, but they stored everything, believing that someday they would. That someday arrived in 1940 when Friedman's team began noticing strange regularities, letter pairings that appeared slightly more often than randomness would allow. It was a flicker of pattern in the noise. Rowlett and his colleagues realized something radical. Purple didn't encrypt all letters the same way. It divided the alphabet into two separate circuits, one for 6 letters, one for the remaining 20. By identifying which circuit each letter belonged to, they began to reverse engineer the logic. What they constructed next was an artificial mirror of the Japanese device, built entirely from telephone parts, solder, and mathematical intuition. The first time it decrypted a real Japanese message, no one in the room spoke. The air was thick with disbelief. For the Americans, the breakthrough was both exhilarating and terrifying. They were now peering into the private cables between Tokyo and its diplomats, communications that Japan assumed were sealed tighter than steel vaults. Among those transmissions were negotiations with Germany, reports from spies, and eventually diplomatic hints of a growing rift with the United States. The code that was supposed to guarantee Japan's secrecy had become a window into its intentions. But decoding secrets is one thing. Interpreting their meaning in time to act would be another story. The room was windowless, lit by the cold buzz of fluorescent lamps. Every hour, a courier would enter with a fresh batch of intercepted Japanese messages, raw encrypted streams of numbers and letters. Every hour, those same messages would leave the room reborn in English. By late 1940, magic had matured into one of the most powerful intelligence tools in the world. Inside the U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Service and the Navy's OP-20G, the once small team of codebreakers had grown into a disciplined operation. Yet almost no one outside those walls knew what magic meant. Even senior generals were told only what they needed to know. Each morning, newly decoded messages were printed in a handful of copies stamped Top Secret Magic and hand-delivered in locked briefcases to a select group. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Secretaries of War and Navy, the Army Chief of Staff, and a few trusted intelligence officers. What those papers contained was extraordinary. They revealed Tokyo's instructions to its diplomats, who to flatter, who to pressure, where to buy steel, oil, and tungsten. They described the inner debates of Japan's cabinet and the growing tension with Washington as American embargoes tightened around the empire's neck. In one decrypted cable, the Japanese ambassador in Berlin reported Hitler's private thoughts about Japan's war prospects. In another, diplomats in Washington described the tense but polite negotiations with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, unaware that every word they sent home was already being read by Hull's own government. But there was also unease inside the magic team. They were decoding more messages than the intelligence community could meaningfully analyze. Information piled up faster than understanding. A message might be decrypted hours after it mattered, or interpreted in a way that led to false conclusions. Worse, inter-service rivalry began to infect the flow of information. The Army guarded its decrypts. The Navy withheld its intercepts. There was no unified command, no shared database. Each branch feared leaks more than ignorance. Still, the breakthroughs continued. By mid-1941, magic analysts knew Japan was preparing for something major, but not where or when. Cables spoke of a decisive moment approaching, of operations that will determine our empire's fate. Friedman, recovered but still fragile, wrote that they were reading shadows, words without context, events without coordinates. The frustration was immense. They could hear Japan whispering its intentions, yet the meaning remained just out of reach. In early December, the messages became darker. Tokyo ordered its Washington embassy to destroy code machines and burn documents. On December 6th, the 14th part of a long diplomatic message arrived, one that would later haunt history. The Americans decrypted it overnight. It severed relations between Japan and the United States. But even as Washington read those words, the clock in Hawaii was ticking toward morning. December 7th, 1941, it began like any other Sunday in Hawaii. The morning sun cut across the calm waters of Pearl Harbor, glinting off battleships anchored in neat rows. Sailors were still waking, the air thick with the smell of breakfast and sea salt. Half a world away, in Washington, D.C., the real battle was already underway, not of bullets, but of minutes. At 9:00 p.m. on December 6th, President Roosevelt received a decoded Japanese message, the 14th and final part of a long, formal note from Tokyo to its Washington embassy. It broke off diplomatic relations in cold, deliberate language. To Roosevelt, a man who'd spent months balancing sanctions and negotiations, the meaning was unmistakable. He reportedly turned to his aide, Harry Hopkins, and said quietly, "This means war." But the message said nothing about where or when. As more fragments arrived through the night, the magic analysts worked without pause. They decrypted an urgent order from Tokyo instructing its Washington embassy to deliver the note to the U.S. government precisely at 1 p.m., Washington time, 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. The timing was eerie, but no one knew what it meant. Army and Navy intelligence officers rushed to alert commands across the Pacific, but communications were slow and disjointed. A warning message was drafted, encoded, and transmitted, but the radio circuit to Hawaii was clogged. The Army Signal Center sent it by commercial Western Union telegram instead. It arrived hours too late. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese bombers descended on Oahu. The sky erupted in black smoke and flame. Battleships convulsed as torpedoes struck their hulls. The USS Arizona split open, its forward magazine detonating in a column of fire that could be seen miles away. Back in Washington, Navy and Army intelligence staff realized the nightmare they'd been chasing had already begun. The cable confirming the attack reached D.C. just minutes after the final decrypted Japanese message had been read aloud to senior officers. For the cryptanalysts of magic, men and women who had spent years prying open Japan's secrets, the moment was unbearable. They had known something was coming. They had intercepted the enemy's voice, but their warnings had been trapped in the machinery of bureaucracy. Historians still debate whether magic could have prevented Pearl Harbor. Some argue that the intelligence was too vague, that the signals pointed to war, not to Hawaii. Others say that clearer coordination between Washington and the Pacific commands might have changed everything. What is certain is that the tragedy exposed a new kind of vulnerability. For the first time in modern warfare, knowledge had arrived faster than understanding. In the weeks that followed, amid the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, America reorganized its intelligence operations. The Army and Navy began sharing their decrypts under a joint coordination board. Information that once sat in filing cabinets now flowed to battle planners. Magic, born in silence, would now speak directly to the war effort, and within 6 months its silent power would help deliver the first decisive American victory of the Pacific War. June 1942. The Pacific was vast, but for the first time in the war, the United States knew exactly where the enemy would be. After the disaster of Pearl Harbor, America's cryptanalytic efforts had fused into a coordinated machine. In Hawaii, inside a dim underground room at Station Haipo, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his small band of linguists and mathematicians were working alongside the Navy's best radio intercept operators, their job to uncover Japan's next move. By then, Japan's forces were unstoppable across Asia and the Pacific. The Philippines had fallen, Singapore was gone. The Imperial Navy roamed freely, preparing to lure what was left of the U.S. fleet into a trap. The plan's code name was Operation MI, an assault on a small atoll called Midway, meant to draw out and annihilate America's aircraft carriers. But Japan's confidence rested on one assumption, that its communications were unreadable. They were wrong. Rochefort and his cryptanalysts had been reading Japan's operational code, known as JN-25, for months, though only in fragments. Magic had revealed Tokyo's diplomatic posture, but Haipo focused on the Navy's combat signals. By combining both, the Americans were beginning to see the full picture: Japan's strength, movements, and even its deception. The breakthrough came through a clever ruse. To confirm the target's identity, Rochefort suggested that Midway's radio operators send an uncoded message reporting that their freshwater condenser had failed. Within hours, Japanese transmissions, intercepted by Haipo, repeated that same detail, describing AF as short on water. AF was midway. The trap was revealed. Armed with that knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz repositioned his limited carrier forces, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to lie in wait northeast of Midway. It was an audacious gamble, guided almost entirely by code breaking. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese fleet arrived exactly where the Americans expected. When their carrier decks filled with planes preparing for a second strike, U.S. dive bombers appeared through the clouds. In 5 furious minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were engulfed in fire. By the end of the day, 4 were gone. Japan's naval dominance was shattered. The balance of the Pacific had shifted. For Rochefort's team, the victory was both vindication and silence. Their work remained secret, classified even from many in the Navy. The official reports credited courage, tactics, and luck, but in truth, the battle had been won in that small room beneath Pearl Harbor weeks before the first bomb fell. Intelligence had become a weapon, not of destruction, but of foresight. From that moment, the U.S. would never again fight a war blind. Victory brought confidence, but also paranoia. After Midway, the United States had done the impossible, turned knowledge into firepower. Yet with that success came an even deeper layer of secrecy. Only a handful of people in the entire U.S. government truly understood how the victory had been achieved. Within intelligence circles, a new phrase began to circulate: the curse of knowing too much. Magic was still operational, decoding Japan's diplomatic traffic daily. Station Hypo and its sister units were breaking the Imperial Navy's ciphers faster than ever. But now, instead of open collaboration, rivalries hardened. The Army and Navy guarded their decrypts like personal trophies. Even allies, including Britain's legendary Bletchley Park, which was reading German Enigma traffic, were kept in the dark about Magic's full capabilities. President Roosevelt himself ordered that only a small, vetted circle receive the decrypted intelligence. Messages were hand-carried by couriers in locked pouches. Copies were numbered, counted, and destroyed after reading. The fear was simple but real. If Japan learned its codes were compromised, the entire advantage would vanish overnight. But secrecy cut both ways. Commanders in the field often received outdated or incomplete reports because analysts refused to reveal how the information had been obtained. Some officers went into battle unaware that their enemy's plans were already sitting in Washington's vaults. The silence became dangerous. In late 1943, as Allied cooperation deepened, American codebreakers finally began sharing limited intelligence with the British under the Brusa Agreement, laying the groundwork for what would later become the Five Eyes Alliance. But the old culture of secrecy never truly disappeared. Within the concrete rooms where magic still hummed, the analysts knew. Every decoded message carried both power and peril. Each secret they uncovered risked becoming its own liability. In the shadows of triumph, the walls were getting thicker. August 1945, the world that had once lived in code was suddenly violently silent. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The broadcasts that once filled the air with encrypted chatter, orders, coordinates, and reports faded into static. For the cryptanalysts who had lived inside that secret world, the silence was surreal. In Washington, the offices of the Signal Intelligence Service and OP-20G emptied slowly. The same men and women who had read Japan's most intimate secrets now packed up their papers and machines under strict instruction. Never speak of what you've done. Even the word magic disappeared from official vocabulary. Its files were locked behind reinforced doors, its machinery dismantled and stored in anonymous crates. Many of its members returned to civilian life, carrying the weight of a secret victory that history would not acknowledge. William Friedman, frail, gray-haired, but still meticulous, wrote a quiet memorandum before retiring. It read simply, "Knowledge won the war, but knowledge must remain silent." For years, even senior military historians were unaware that Operation Magic had existed. When accounts of Pearl Harbor and Midway were written in the 1940s and 50s, they spoke of valor, of luck, of tactical genius, never of the rooms filled with wire relays and sleepless minds. Meanwhile, Japan, too, tried to understand how its empire's communications had been so thoroughly penetrated. In the post-war Tokyo trials, several diplomats were stunned to learn that the Allies had been reading their most secret dispatches since 1940. One remarked bitterly, "We had been speaking to ourselves, and they were always listening." In America, the secrecy extended even to its allies. British officers who had shared Enigma decrypts with Washington during the war were surprised to learn decades later that the Americans had been running a parallel operation of similar magnitude. The Magic Room in Washington, once the beating heart of U.S. wartime intelligence, was decommissioned quietly. The people who had worked there were scattered into new agencies, the Armed Forces Security Agency, then later the National Security Agency, born in 1952. Magic became their myth, a ghost whispered about in hallways, the operation that proved what hidden information could do when paired with imagination and will. But for those who lived it, the legacy was bittersweet. They had helped shorten the war, saved untold lives, and altered history, yet their triumph was classified, their names unknown. In the end, the codebreakers of Operation Magic didn't seek fame. What they sought was understanding. And for decades, that understanding remained locked away, buried beneath layers of ink, secrecy, and time. The war ended, but the signals never stopped. They simply changed frequency. By the late 1940s, a new kind of global struggle was emerging. The Cold War, a conflict of ideology and information. Armies still stood ready, but the most decisive battles would now be fought in radio waves, cables, and invisible networks. In this new world, the legacy of Operation Magic was everywhere. The techniques born in those cramped Washington offices, traffic analysis, code reconstruction, and real-time decryption, became the DNA of modern intelligence. When the National Security Agency, NSA, was quietly established in 1952, many of its founding cryptanalysts had once worked under Friedman or Rochefort. Their lessons were clear. Secrecy was power, and information was no longer a support for war. It was war. The Cold War brought a new enemy, the Soviet Union. But the methods were hauntingly familiar. Where Magic once read Japan's purple code, the NSA now listened for Moscow's encrypted radio bursts, monitoring everything from diplomatic cables to the first satellite transmissions. Across the Atlantic, Britain's GCHQ, born from Bletchley Park, became America's closest ally. Together they formed the Five Eyes Alliance, a global surveillance network that owed its existence to the cryptologic partnerships seeded during World War II. Technology evolved, but the philosophy remained the same. The same logic that once drove mechanical stepping switches now powered transistors, then microchips, then supercomputers. The same hunger to know first drove the creation of satellites, spy planes, and eventually digital networks that encircled the planet. Magic's spirit lived on in every intercepted signal, every decrypted message, every quiet decision made in the shadow of secrecy. Yet its story carried a warning. For all its brilliance, Operation Magic also revealed the danger of information imbalance, when one side sees too much, too soon, and forgets that understanding requires context. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor had proven that even perfect intelligence can fail when bureaucracy, pride, or fear slow its translation into action. Today, the descendants of those early codebreakers no longer hunch over typewriters. They sit before glowing screens, deciphering patterns of data that stretch across oceans in milliseconds. Their battlefield is digital, their enemy often unseen. But the lineage is unmistakable. Every encrypted email, every algorithm, every digital intrusion carries a whisper from that first secret war, from the nights when paper, wire, and logic beat an empire built on silence. Operation Magic ended in 1945, but its echo, the belief that knowledge can shape the fate of nations, never stopped. And perhaps, in that quiet hum of decoding machines and data streams, the voices of Friedman, Rowlett, and Rochefort still linger, reminding us that the greatest victories are often the ones no one ever sees. The Japanese cipher that America broke, Operation Magic's silent victory. A story not of guns or glory, but of minds, listening to the whispers that changed the world.